Hi, I'm Jim Bearden, and this is Leadership at the Points of Contact, Lesson 3 actually, in a series of 26 5 to 6 minute videos designed to help you function more effectively as an organizational leader. In this section of the program, we're looking at one of the key roles that leaders play, and that is to consciously create cultures that reinforce and support behavior essential to organizational success. In the previous lesson, we more specifically defined the culture we're looking to create as one that is hero-friendly, one in which people are going to be more willing to step up and speak up and listen up and take reasonable risks. In this lesson, I want to focus on what I see as two approaches being used by people in leadership positions to create cultures. Actually, we'll look at both of them, but one is used almost exclusively, and the other, we'll call it the road less traveled, is the one that I'm going to be encouraging you to use. But before we look at these two approaches, I want to bring a distinction into play here that will apply not only to the two approaches, but will apply to many of the other topics that we're going to cover in this program. And that is the distinction between a strategic and a tactical perspective. Now, I know strategies and tactics are things that we are very familiar with, but I want you to think about it in terms of a perspective. A strategic perspective is one, I'm sure you would agree, is broader, is longer term, right? It is where, with a strategic perspective, we would look to define or describe general outcomes that we're looking to achieve in broad areas. For example, most organizations have marketing strategies. They may have sales strategies, or they may identify outcomes like increased market share or increased customer retention. Strategic perspective, again, is broader and longer term. The tactical perspective, on the other hand, is more narrow and shorter term, and where the strategic perspective would be focusing on general outcomes and general areas, the tactical perspective would be looking for processes, maybe even defining the processes that we would use to produce the outcomes or to meet the strategic expectations. Now, these two different perspectives come into play in these two different approaches to creating culture. The first approach, and the approach that is used far more often, is what I call the unconscious approach. And in the unconscious approach, which is a more strategic approach to dealing with culture, the efforts of the people participating focus almost exclusively on defining the culture. Defining the culture is done by creating documents, things like core values, things like mission statement, things like guiding strategies. These are documents containing words and phrases that the creators have used to describe the sort of culture that they would like to create. The alternative approach, the conscious approach, is, as I indicated earlier, the road less traveled. It is used far less frequently, but I am absolutely convinced that it will produce a culture that does indeed reinforce and support behavior essential to organizational success. The conscious approach is a combination of strategic and tactical. And here's what I mean. We said in the strategic or the unconscious approach that the focus was almost exclusively on defining the culture. In the conscious approach, the same thing plays out. We still put some effort into defining, or more accurately, we might look to redefine the culture. For example, a client that I'm working with right now in my consulting practice has recently assumed a key leadership position in a relatively large organization. Obviously, he inherited a culture. He recognized that he wanted to make some changes, is bringing members of his leadership team together. They are redefining. So there is a strategic element to the conscious approach. But here's where most of the energy in the conscious approach goes, and that's into identifying the specific situations and the specific behaviors that are necessary to bring the culture to life. I told you in a previous lesson that a key role for leaders is to close the gaps between what sounds good in what gets done. And where culture is concerned, that gap is between the professed culture, the defined culture, and the actual culture, what people in the organization do. And so this conscious approach requires people in leadership positions to take some very specific steps. As a matter of fact, there are 6 of them, and in the following lessons, we're going to take each of those 6 steps, and I'm going to give you some specific instructions or directions or suggestions for how you can adapt and implement those steps in your organization. Let's look at the action items for lesson number 3. What words or phrases are used to define your organizational culture? Now, you can get those from a couple of sources. You can look at your foundational documents, mission statement, core values, or you can look back on the action items you completed in the previous lesson. But I want you to identify words or phrases that define your culture. And then second, what are some of the things you and other members of your leadership team can do or have done to translate those words and phrases into specific behavior? Remember, completing the action items is how you bring this lesson to life. So be sure and do that.